The silent collapse. The galaxy was vast and filled with countless civilizations, yet among the stars, there was one world that had fallen into shadows. A world once green with wide rivers and mountains that sang with the voices of its people, now reduced to silence, broken only by the wind that carried the smell of dust and decay. The world of the Therans was dying, and everyone knew it. The Therans were not a powerful species. They were not conquerors, nor did they hold seats in the Grand Council that decided the fate of many worlds. They were simple people who had lived on their homeworld for generations, building a society of harmony with nature and with one another. Their songs once echoed across valleys. Their children once played in fields of golden grass. Their cities had been small but full of life. Yet all of it was crumbling under the weight of a plague that no healer could stop, in raids from neighbors who saw them as weak. The disease came first. It crept like a shadow, spreading across villages until whole families were gone in a single night. Bodies weakened until they could not rise. Again, mothers wept for their children. Fathers watched helpless as their strength faded. The Therans begged the Galactic Council for help. They sent desperate signals across the void of space, but what they received in return was silence or cold replies, telling them that resources could not be wasted on a doomed world. When the invaders came, it was as if the last hope had been stolen. The skies burned with fire as ships descended and villages were torn apart. Survivors scattered into caves and ruins, trying to cling to life as the plague still spread through them. The Therans began to believe that their end was certain, that no one would stand for them, no one would fight for them, no one would save them. They were the forgotten, the abandoned. But not every voice in the stars had turned away. Far away on the edge of human-explored space, a man named Daniel listened. He was not a soldier of high rank. He was not a leader of nations. He was simply an explorer who had traveled the dark between the stars in search of knowledge and meaning. He heard the broken call of the Therans through static-filled transmissions that most had ignored, and something in those voices reached into his heart. Where others heard weakness, he heard a plea. Where others saw futility, he saw a life that still had worth. Daniel was a human, and humans had a strange way of refusing to accept what others called impossible. They were stubborn to a fault, driven by an instinct to protect and endure. He knew the council had dismissed the Therans. He knew that great empires would do nothing, yet he felt a pull inside him that would not let him turn away. To watch an entire species die was not something he could accept, not while he had breath in his body. So he set course for the Theran homeworld, his small vessel cutting through the void, while others laughed at the futility of his mission. It was only one man against the certainty of death, yet Daniel did not see it that way. To him, it was never about saving them all at once. It was about being there, standing where no one else would. He had no great fleet behind him, no advanced weapons of war, but he carried something more powerful, a will to stand against despair. When his ship descended through the gray skies of the Theran world, he saw with his own eyes what had been lost fields once alive, now blackened, villages reduced to empty shells, bodies covered in ash and dust. He walked among them in silence, his heart heavy yet not broken. He found survivors in the ruins, hiding with hollow eyes and weak bodies, children clinging to elders who could barely move. When they saw him, they pulled away in fear, for no one had ever come to help before, and many believed any stranger could only mean more suffering. But Daniel did not leave. He opened his supplies and gave them water, clean water that did not carry disease, shared food from his ship, and showed them how to prepare it safely. He gave medicine from the stores he had carried for months on his journeys, and though the Therans did not trust him at first, slowly they began to see that he was not there to harm them. He did not ask for tribute. He did not demand obedience. He only worked to keep them alive. Days were long and heavy, the nights filled with the cries of the sick and the silence of those who had already gone. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing on his soul, yet every morning he rose to continue his work. He repaired broken wells, taught them ways to boil and clean water, showed them how to plant simple crops that could grow even in the weak soil that disease had spared. He listened To their songs, though, they were faint and broken, and in return, he shared stories of humanity, of how his people had faced wars, famine, and darkness, yet always found a way to rise again. For the first time in many seasons, the Therans began to feel a spark, a sense that perhaps they were not entirely forsaken, that though the galaxy had abandoned them, one human had not, and that small truth was enough to stir something inside them, like embers glowing faintly in the ash, till danger lingered. Beyond the horizon, the invaders who circled like vultures waiting to strike again, the disease that spread in secret, claiming more lives. Daniel knew the battle was far from over. He was only one man with limited tools, yet as he looked into the tired eyes of the Therans, he made a silent promise. He would not leave them. Not until every breath had left his body. Not until he had given all he could. Where others saw a doomed species, Daniel saw life. Where others turned away, he chose to stay. And in the silence of that broken world, a story began that would echo far beyond the stars. A story, not of fleets or empires, but of a single human who refused to let hope die. The lone human Daniel worked tirelessly among the ruins of the Theran people, and though he was only one man, his hands never rested, his mind never stopped thinking, and his heart never stopped carrying the weight of those who still looked to him. With cautious eyes, the Therans were not sure how to see him, for their history had taught them that no outsider ever came with kindness, yet each day he stayed, each moment he gave them food or medicine or comfort, chipped away at the walls they had built to protect themselves from disappointment. The Therans had lived so long under despair that hope felt dangerous. They feared to trust, because trust had always ended in pain. When Daniel first sat among them, they turned their faces away. Their voices whispered that he would leave as the others had left, that he would see their suffering and decide it was not worth the cost. But Daniel remained. He rose before the sun and worked beside them. As if he had been born among them, he taught them not with pride, but with patience, his words simple, his gestures calm. And in time, even the most doubtful among them began to watch him with something new, something that might one day be called belief. It was not easy for him. The disease was relentless, and every morning he found new victims, weak and trembling, their lives slipping away like water through his fingers. He gave them medicine from his small stores, but he knew it would not be enough. His supplies would run out, and the plague was stronger than anything he had faced before. He kept notes by the dim light of his lamp, studying every symptom, every pattern, hoping to find a way to fight it. He wrote and studied, even when exhaustion pulled at his body, because he could not let them go, not while he still had strength. When the children cried from hunger, Daniel gave them food from his own share. When the elders shivered in the night, he gave them his blanket. When the wells ran dry, he walked far into the plains to bring back clean water from his ship. And when raiders tried to test the weakness of the Therans, he stood in their path, not with great weapons, but with the courage that came from knowing that some things were worth more than his own safety. At first, the Therans could not understand him. They asked him why he stayed, why he risked his life for those he did not know. Daniel had no grand answer. He only said that life was precious, and that no one deserved to be forgotten. He told them that his people too had once been near extinction many times in their history, and only by standing together had they survived. Those words sank into the hearts of the Therans, because they had always felt alone, abandoned in the cold of the galaxy. But this one human's voice told them they were not as worthless as they had come to believe. Therans began to change slowly. They lifted their heads when Daniel spoke. They followed him when he showed them how to build small shelters from ruins. They listened when he taught them to plant hardy crops in soil they had thought dead. When he repaired broken tools with steady hands, they marveled at his resourcefulness. One night, when the fires burned low and the air was heavy with sorrow, he told them stories of the oceans of Earth, of how humans had crossed them with nothing but wooden ships and courage, and how they had endured storms and wars, yet always found their way home. And the Therans listened with quiet eyes, and some even smiled. Still, The shadows of despair lingered on the horizon. The invaders had not forgotten this world. They circled in ships like predators, waiting for the moment when the Therans would be weakest. Daniel knew they would return stronger than before, and he also knew that when they came, he would stand against them, no matter the cost, yet he also understood that standing alone would not be enough. He had to prepare the Therans not just to survive, but to defend themselves. So, he began to teach them the lessons he carried from his own people. He showed them how to fight not with brute force, but with cleverness. How to use the land to their advantage, how to set traps that would turn the ground itself into a weapon, how to move silently and strike when least expected. At first, the Therans were fearful, for they had been a peaceful people, but as Daniel trained them, they began to discover strength they had not known was still within them. In those days, the bond between Daniel and the Therans grew deeper. He was no longer only the stranger from the stars. He was the one who carried water, who healed the sick, who stood guard in the night. He was the one who gave them lessons of survival when all others had given them lessons of abandonment. He had become a brother among them, and though they still struggled with disease and hunger, a light had begun to burn in their hearts. The galaxy did not remain silent forever. Whispers began to spread through the stars about the human who had gone to save a doomed species. The Galactic Council sent warnings that his actions were reckless and useless. They told him to leave before he wasted his life. They declared the Therans a lost cause, and warned that his interference would only draw trouble upon himself. But Daniel did not listen, for he had looked into the eyes of the children who had once been too weak to smile, and had seen them laugh again, and he knew that was worth more than all the warnings of distant rulers. Every night when Daniel lay under the faint glow of the stars above the ruined land, he thought about what was still to come. He knew the disease had to be cured, or it would claim more lives than he could save with his hands alone. He knew the invaders would come again, with fire and weapons far stronger than what he had. He knew he was only one man against storms too large for any human to stop yet. He also knew that sometimes one man could make a difference, and that thought carried him forward. And so the story of the doomed species began to shift, for though they were still surrounded by shadows, though their bodies were still weak, though fear still crept into their hearts, they now had something they had not carried in many years. They had hope, and that hope came not from fleets or empires, but from one human who had chosen to stay when all others turned away. Rising tensions. Days on the Theran world moved like a heavy tide, slow and filled with struggle, yet underneath the weight of despair there was a new rhythm, a rhythm shaped by the presence of Daniel, the human who refused to turn away. The Therans had begun to trust him, and their trust was not empty, for they saw how he never rested, how he gave his strength freely, and how he carried no pride in his work, only the will to see them stand again. But the disease continued its march across the land, and every time Daniel thought he had slowed it, another wave of sickness would rise. Whole families felt of fevers and weakness there. Breath shallow, their bodies trembling. Daniel sat with them. He wiped their foreheads with cloth soaked in water. He whispered words of comfort that they could not understand in his language, but could feel in his tone. Still, he knew that comfort was not enough. He had to find a way to fight the illness, not only to ease it, but to break it. Worked through the night studying the plants of the land, testing roots and leaves, boiling them, mixing them with small amounts of human medicine from his ship. He kept records scratched into pieces of broken wood because paper was scarce. He grew thin from lack of sleep, but he did not stop. Every time he saw a child fall to the sickness, it drove him harder, and though despair often reached for his heart, he would look into the faces of the Therans who waited on him with quiet hope, and he would not let it take him. The Therans began to help him more closely. Some gathered herbs for him, some brought clean water, some built small fires so he could continue his work into the dark of night. The bond between them grew strong like roots, gripping deep soil, and though they still called him the stranger from the stars, he was no longer seen as distant. He had become part of their survival. Yet The disease was not the only shadow pressing on them. The invaders still circled like wolves. Daniel knew the day would come when they would descend again to finish what they had started, and he feared it would come before he had any cure ready. So he continued to train the Therans. He showed them how to hold simple weapons, sharpened from scrap and stone, how to move silently across the ruins, how to watch the skies for the shadow of ships that might appear without warning. He told them again and again that strength was not only in muscle, but in unity, that if they stood together, they could endure even the storms of fire. At first the Therans were frightened by the thought of fighting back. They had lived too long under defeat, but Daniel's voice had a weight that drew them forward, and as he trained them, their fear began to change into something else. It became resolve. Not as sharp as a blade, but steady like the earth under their feet, and soon they could stand beside him, with eyes that no longer looked only at the ground, but ahead into the distance. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Daniel climbed a broken tower with a group of Theran scouts. From there, they saw movement on the far edge of the plains. The invaders were gathering their machines, their ships gleaming in the fading light. It was clear they were preparing for another strike, and Daniel felt his chest tighten because he knew they were stronger and better armed than the small group of survivors at his side. But he also knew that if he left them unprepared, they would all be swept away. That night he spoke to the Therans gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the flicker of flames, their eyes heavy with fear. He told them that the invaders would come soon, and that they must choose to fight or to fall. He told them that he could not promise victory, but he could promise that if they stood together, if they believed in themselves, then they would not go down forgotten. They would go down remembered as a people who fought for their right to live. His words sank into them like sparks into dry wood, and slowly heads began to lift, and voices murmured their agreement. They would fight. Following days were filled with preparation. Daniel taught them how to dig trenches and hide them with branches. He showed them how to set traps in narrow paths and how to build barriers from broken stone and metal. He turned the land itself into their ally. He worked with no rest, as if time itself were chasing him, and the Therans followed his example. Their hands blistered, their bodies tired, but their hearts growing stronger. Even as they prepared for war, the sickness continued to take its toll, and Daniel felt torn between the battlefield and the sick rooms. He moved from one to the other, his hands never idle, one moment mixing herbs, the next moment lifting heavy stones to build defenses. The Therans saw him weaken from exhaustion, yet he did not allow himself to fall, because he knew that if he broke, then all hope might break with him. Then the day came when the skies burned with fire again. The invaders descended, their ships cutting across the clouds, their machines thundering across the plains. The ground shook with their arrival. The Therans gathered, closed their weapons, crewed, their hearts pounding. Daniel stood at their front, his eyes sharp, his body steady, though inside he carried the weight of fear. He knew they were outmatched, but he also knew that courage sometimes meant standing, even when defeat seemed certain. First clash was brutal. The invaders swept across the land, confident they would crush what little remained of the Therans. But the traps Daniel had laid tore into them. Hidden trenches swallowed machines, sharp stones rained down from cliffs, barriers forced them into narrow paths where Theran fighters struck from shadows. The invaders stumbled, surprised by resistance they had not expected, and though the Therans were fewer, they fought with a fire they had not known before. In the chaos, Daniel moved among them, not as a leader who gave orders from afar, but as one who stood shoulder to shoulder with them. He defended the weak. He struck where enemies broke through. He called out encouragement when fear threatened to return. The Theran saw him covered in dust and blood, yet still unyielding, and it filled them with strength. The battle was far from over, and the sickness still spread through their people, but for the first time in a long time the Therans felt the taste of defiance. They felt the power of hope sharpened into action. They were not only victims anymore, they were fighters standing on their own land, and at their side was the human who refused to abandon them. As the night closed around the burning fields, Daniel looked at the weary faces of those still alive, and he knew the fight was only beginning, yet he also knew that something had changed forever, because no matter how strong the enemy or how cruel the plague, the Therans had begun to believe, and belief was a weapon greater than any blade or machine. The last stand. The night after the first clash was filled with smoke and the cries of the wounded, yet within those cries there was something new, the sound of survival. The invaders had been forced back, though not destroyed, and the Therans had stood where they once would have fled. Daniel sat among them, his body covered in dust and his arms heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with determination. He knew the battle was not yet won, for the invaders had tested them and would now return stronger. The days passed. Daniel divided his strength between two endless struggles: on one side the war that pressed from the skies, and on the other the disease that still consumed the weak. He worked in the shelters by night, testing mixtures of herbs with small fragments of human medicine, and in the morning he trained the Therans, sharpening their defenses, teaching them how to stand together when the storm came again. He grew thinner each day, his face marked with weariness, but he would not stop, for he understood that if he faltered, both battles would be lost. The Therans followed his lead with a devotion they had never known before. They were no longer a people waiting for death. They were a people learning to fight for their lives. They built stronger barriers, turned broken ruins into walls, and carved hidden paths through the hills so they could move unseen when enemies advanced. Children who had once sat silent in sickness now carried stones for building, while elders gave what little wisdom they could. Their world was still broken, but within the ruins a spirit had risen that could not be broken so easily. Daniel spent long nights in the dim glow of fire, mixing roots and boiling leaves. The sickness was merciless, but he began to notice patterns, and plants slowed the fever. Others gave strength to those too weak to stand. He combined them with fragments of medicine from his ship, testing carefully, marking results on scraps of wood with shaking hands. Slowly he began to believe he was close to something that might hold back the plague, at least enough to give them time. But time was the one thing he had little of, because the invaders were moving. One morning the scouts rushed back from the plains, their voices filled with fear. They had seen the sky darken with ships more than before, larger and better armed. The invaders were coming with a force meant to finish what they had started. The Therans looked to Daniel, their eyes filled with both fear and expectation, and he knew this was the moment he had been preparing them for. If they failed now, the species would vanish, and his struggle would mean nothing. That night, Daniel spoke to them not as a leader from above, as one of them sitting by the fire. His voice steady, though his body trembled from fatigue. He told them that the enemy was stronger, but strength alone did not win wars. He told them that they carried something greater, the will to live, the will to stand for one another. He told them that the galaxy had left them behind, but they were not forgotten, not while he still breathed. His words spread among them like fire, and when the flames of the camp flickered in their eyes, he saw not despair but courage. The next dawn came with thunder from the sky. The invader fleet broke through the clouds, pouring fire upon the land. Their machines thundered across the earth. Their soldiers moved with cruel precision. The Therans took their places behind walls of stone and earth, weapons in hand. Daniel stood at the front, his heart heavy yet steady. This was the last stand, and he would not let it break. The battle began with fire raining from the sky, but the traps they had set turned the land into a shield. Hidden trenches collapsed beneath heavy machines. Cliffs exploded with rolling stones that crushed lines of enemy soldiers, and from the shadows Theran fighters struck fast and disappeared. The invaders roared in anger, unprepared for such resistance. They had expected to find only a dying people, but instead they faced a force guided by human cunning and Theran courage. Daniel moved among them like a flame where the lines faltered. He rushed in where fear threatened. He shouted words of strength. His arms swung heavy weapons made from broken scrap, his body battered yet unyielding. At one point he saw a group of Theran children trapped behind a wall of fire, and without hesitation he charged through smoke, pulling them to safety. His skin burned, his breath ragged, but he did not stop because in their eyes he saw the reason he had come, the reason he could not fail. Hours passed and the field was painted with fire and blood. The Therans fell, but so did the invaders, and for every life lost, more courage seemed to rise from the survivors. Daniel fought until his body screamed for rest, until every muscle burned, but still he stood because he knew the Therans looked to him as their anchor, and if he fell, they might fall too at last. When the sun dipped low, the invaders began to pull back, their losses heavy, their pride wounded by resistance. They had never expected. The Therans stood together on ground still burning with smoke, their weapons shaking in tired hands, yet they had not been broken. Daniel looked at them, his chest heaving, his body scarred and bleeding, yet he felt a weight lift from his heart. They had faced the storm and survived, but he knew this was not the end. The invaders would come again, and the disease still claimed lives every day, but they had bought time, and sometimes time was the sharpest weapon of all. That night, Daniel sat alone with his mixtures, watching as the liquid swirled in the firelight. He tested it once more on a young Theran who had been near death, and for the first time he saw the fever break the body. Grew still, the breathing steadied, hope filled him like fire in his veins. Though it was not a perfect cure, it was the first real step he had taken against the plague, and he knew that if he could refine it, he could save many more lives. Exhaustion pulled at him, but he forced his body to continue. He prepared more doses with trembling hands, giving them to the weakest. And though not all survived, many did, and the Therans who had once waited for death now whispered with awe. They spoke of the stranger who had not only defended them against invaders, but who had broken the grip of the sickness that had haunted them for so long. Dawn after the battle was quiet. The smoke cleared slowly, and for the first time in many years the Therans looked upon their land not only with sorrow, but with pride. They had stood, they had fought, and they had survived, and though the enemy would return, though dangers still lingered, they were no longer the helpless species, abandoned by the galaxy. They were the people saved by one who refused to turn away. And as Daniel looked upon them, standing in the ruins, yet standing strong, he knew the final chapter was still ahead. But he also knew that whatever came next, he would face it with them until the very end, a species reborn. The days after the battle were heavy with silence. The fields were littered with broken machines, and the air still carried the smoke of fire. But through that silence something began to move. It was not the sound of mourning alone, it was the sound of rebuilding. The Therans who had once only waited for death now walked with steadier steps. They lifted stones to rebuild walls. They carried the wounded with care. They lit fires not just for warmth, but for gathering. Because they had seen with their own eyes that they could stand and survive. Daniel moved among them, though his body was marked with scars, and his strength drained. He refused to rest more than a few hours each day, for he knew his work was not finished. The invaders might return at any time, and the disease still lingered like a shadow on the edge of every breath. He spent his days refining the mixture. He had created adjusting portions of roots, testing combinations with the fragments of medicine from his ship, each attempt noted carefully until he found patterns that gave results stronger and more reliable, and slowly more lives were saved. Therans began to speak his name not as a stranger, but as a protector. Some called him the Shield. Others whispered of him as the fire that refused to die. They had no words in their language to fully describe him, but in their eyes, he was more than a visitor. He had become part of their people. Children followed him as he worked, asking questions. Learning from his hands, elders sat beside him in silence, drawing strength from his presence. Even the most doubtful had begun to believe that his arrival was not chance, but something their world had been given when all else abandoned them. As the cure spread through the survivors, the sickness began to lose its hold. For the first time in many seasons, families no longer wept daily for their young. Instead, they watched as weak bodies grew stronger, as fevers broke, as voices once silenced by pain rose again in song. It was not perfect. The disease still claimed some, but its power was no longer unstoppable. The balance had shifted, and with each day more lived then. Died the invaders did not strike again. Soon perhaps they feared the resistance they had faced. Perhaps they turned their greed toward easier prey. Whatever their reason, the pause gave the Therans precious time, and Daniel used every moment of it to prepare them further. He taught them how to store food, how to build shelters that could withstand storms, how to guard their borders with hidden signs and traps. He gave them not only tools of survival, but knowledge that would outlive him, knowledge that would remain even if he fell. Yet inside, Daniel knew that his own body was reaching its limits. He had given more of himself than he thought possible, and though his will was strong, his flesh carried wounds that would never fully heal. Still, he did not let the Therans see his weakness. He rose each morning as if he carried endless strength, for he knew that his presence was their anchor, and he would not let the anchor break until they were ready to stand without him. One evening, when the stars shone cold above the ruins, Daniel sat by the fire with the leaders of the Therans. They asked him why he had come, why he had chosen them when the whole galaxy had turned away, and Daniel spoke simply. He told them that life itself was worth saving, that no people, no matter how small or how weak, deserved to be forgotten. He told them that when he heard their voices in the void, he could not ignore them, for to ignore them would mean ignoring the very thing that made him human. And the Therans listened with tears in their eyes, for no one had ever spoken such words to them before. Seasons began to pass. The land slowly healed green, returned to the edges of the plains. Crops grew in soil once thought dead. Children ran through the fields, their laughter chasing away the shadows that had hung over their world for so long. The songs of the Therans rose again, though they were different now. Deeper, stronger, shaped by sorrow and survival, yet filled with hope. And in every song the name of the human was carried as part of their story. Daniel stood one morning on a high ridge. Looking across the land, he saw fires burning, not from destruction, but from families gathering. He saw fields planted. He saw homes rebuilt from stone and wood. He saw life where once there had only been silence. And his heart filled with a weight he had carried since the day he arrived. The weight lifted now, for he knew the Therans would endure even without him. They were no longer the doomed species. They were a people reborn. The Therans gathered before him, and their leader spoke with a voice steady and clear, telling him that their survival was his gift, and that his name would be carried through generations. Daniel listened with quiet humility. He did not seek honor. He had not come for glory, but he knew in that moment that his choice to stay had been the only choice he could have made. Though scars marked his body and fatigue still pressed on him, Daniel felt peace. He had given all he could, and in return he had seen a people rise from the ashes. He had seen despair turn into strength. He had seen abandonment turn into unity. And he had seen the truth that one human alone could change the fate of an entire species. Galaxy still looked upon the Therans as weak, still whispered that they had been abandoned, but the Therans knew a different truth. They knew that when the stars had turned cold, when the councils had refused them, when the invaders had sought to erase them, one human had stood beside them, and because of that, they still lived, and so their world began again. Their children grew strong, their songs filled the valleys, their courage spread through every corner of their land, and in the heart of their story was always the human who had chosen to stay when all others had left behind. Daniel watched them with quiet pride, knowing that the future was theirs, not his. He had given them survival, but they had given him purpose. And as the sun rose golden across the horizon, he smiled for the first time in many months. Because he knew the story was complete. The Therans were no longer doomed. They were saved, and the galaxy could never erase that truth. The end.